on page 49. So, welcome. Glad you're here today.
Do you think we're ready to look at the resurrection then?
Absolutely, though I should warn you to be prepared to be a little freaked out.
What do you mean?
Just that Mark's version of the resurrection has been freaking people out for close to 2,000 years.
You've got to be kidding.
Nope. Let's take a look and see. Again, pay attention to the details and let me know what you think. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
I see what you mean by this ending freaking people out. I mean, is that really how it ends?
It sure is. What caught your attention in particular?
Two things. First, Jesus didn't even show up in this ending. I mean, how can we call this the resurrection if the one who's supposed to be resurrected doesn't even make an appearance?
Fair enough.
And second, the women totally fail. I mean, it's not like they've been given complicated instructions. They're told to go and tell the disciples what's just happened. We'd think they'd want to do that anyway, but they don't. They just run away. And Mark seems to go out of his way to tell us that they don't say anything to anyone.
It sounds like this ending makes you a little uncomfortable.
More than a little, but seriously, is this the way it really ends?
There are actually more verses in Mark's gospel. The next ones are called the shorter ending of Mark, and they report that the women do eventually tell the disciples, and then Jesus makes a brief appearance to send the disciples out to preach the gospel. After that comes the longer ending of Mark, which adds a couple of scenes that are similar to some of the resurrection accounts in the other gospels. But most people are convinced that these were added a lot later.
Why?
Two main reasons. First, the oldest copies of Mark's gospel don't contain these verses.
Oldest copies?
We actually don't have the original Mark or any of the books of the Bible for that matter. All we have are later copies, and the oldest of these doesn't have these verses. Second, the style and vocabulary of these two later endings doesn't match the rest of Mark's gospel.
So you think they were added later?
Yeah, and I bet you can guess why.
It seems to me like whoever was doing the copying wanted to clean things up a bit, to make Mark sound a little more like the other gospels, I imagine. To be honest, I can't really blame them, though I think that given what we've said so far, we should try to hear what Mark is really saying, rather than get freaked out by how different his version is from the others.
I agree. So if we stick with the original ending of Mark, even if it's a little unsettling, what do you make of things?
Mostly that these women completely fail. I mean, I guess they eventually had to tell someone something, or we wouldn't have Mark's gospel at all. But in this scene, they totally dropped the ball.
Which doesn't seem all that unusual, does it?
Why not? Oh, wait, I think I see. Throughout the gospel, the disciples have regularly missed the boat, whether they're afraid or don't understand or whatever. they often come off as pretty clueless.
Right.
And so you're saying that maybe we shouldn't be surprised if these women also don't get it.
Right again. This could provide some relief to Mark's community if they have struggled and failed as well. Or it might be that Mark is actually trying to do just the opposite.
What do you mean?
Well, at this point in the story, absolutely no one has followed through. Nobody stayed with Jesus to the end, and now that he's been raised, according to a young man in a white robe at the tomb, no one is going to carry that story to the world.
Which makes for a pretty lousy ending, like we said.
Unless it's not the ending.
I am not following.
There's one more person who knows that Jesus has been raised. One more person who has followed Jesus' ministry, who saw him do miracles, who heard him make predictions about his death and resurrection and about the disciples, and has seen all these predictions come true.
Who's that?
You,
Me?
the reader.
Oh, you mean that Mark has been telling his readers back then and today as well all this stuff about Jesus so we know all that's happened?
Right. The women failed and were the only ones left to tell others what happened.
So maybe Mark wasn't simply trying to make the early Christians he wrote to feel better. Maybe he was also saying they have another chance to go and tell, to share the news about Jesus.
Exactly. Mark creates this dramatic, open-ended story because he wants his readers, all of his readers, to pick up where the story left off, to carry the news the two messengers delivered, to continue Jesus' work.
But I'm still not sure why Jesus didn't show up. I mean, couldn't he have told the disciples all this?
Maybe, but do you think Mark's community got to see Jesus while they were suffering?
Probably not.
And what about you? When you feel down and out, does Jesus come to give you a little one-on-one pep talk in person?
No, definitely not.
But you might have someone else tell you about Jesus, about the God who meets you in your despair and discouragement.
I see what you mean. Mark writes a story where the characters are a lot like us. They don't get a personal appearance from Jesus, and neither do we.
Right, all we have is the message, no proof, just the promise that Jesus is raised so that we'll know not only that God meets us in our suffering, but also that God has triumphed over our suffering, even over death.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think so too.
So, Mark offers this very human Jesus who can identify with us even as he inspires us. Mark is saying that God comes to meet us, not in strength and power, but right in the middle of our suffering. That means we can only really see God in the suffering of the cross, and that because of Jesus, nothing separates us from God. Once we've heard this story, Mark wants us to go and tell others.
That's a great summary.
Thanks. So, are all the gospel stories about the cross this packed with meaning?
Maybe we should keep reading to find out.
Sounds good. Where to next?
Let's look at Luke, who writes about 10 years or so after Mark. He follows much of Mark's outline, but introduces some new elements as well.
Great. Will we look at it as much depth as we did Mark?
There's no substitute for reading the whole Passion narrative, of course, but I think by focusing on a couple of details, we can appreciate how Luke builds on Mark's story to make his own distinct confession about Jesus. So let's start back at Gethsemane, except Luke doesn't tell us that it's Gethsemane. Instead, the scene is the Mount of Olives.
How come?
Luke's probably writing for a community of mostly Gentile Christians, people who weren't originally Jewish, and so he uses the better known and more general names for the area, the Mount of Olives, instead of the more specific local name, Gethsemane.
Interesting.
Okay, like last time, just pay attention to the details. This is from Luke 22. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." And then Jesus withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And when he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" And then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus said, "No more of this." He touched his ear and healed him. And then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." That's the end. So what struck you?
As in Mark, Jesus is a pretty human figure, struggling to do what God wants him to do. One difference I noticed, though, is that it seems like the disciples come off a little better with Luke than with Mark.
Say a little more.
Well, in Mark, the disciples fall asleep 3 times, but Luke only tells about them falling asleep once, and he gives them an excuse. They fell asleep because they were so upset.
That's consistent with the rest of Luke's gospel, where he regularly offers a more sympathetic picture of the disciples than Mark does.
Why do you think he does that?
I can think of 2 reasons. First, keep in mind that part of the reason Mark is so hard on the disciples is to make the point that no one is so inadequate that they can't be a disciple. But that might not be Luke's issue. He might want to show how the disciples were, in fact, pretty decent people who were trying and sometimes succeeding to be faithful. Second, this gospel is just the first half of Luke's larger work.
Really?
Yes, Luke's second book, called the Acts of the Apostles, tells the story of the early church, the time from when Jesus ascended to heaven after the resurrection to near the end of the Apostle Paul's ministry. And because the main characters of this book are the disciples, I suspect Luke figured that it would be more believable if they've got their act a little more together in the gospel. So not only does Luke tell us that they fell asleep once in this scene, but a little earlier, at the Last Supper, Jesus doesn't warn them about falling away, but instead promises that even though they will be tested, they won't ultimately fail.
That is really a much more generous picture of the disciples.
What else did you notice?
I don't remember Jesus healing the guy whose ear got cut off in Mark.
That's right, Mark doesn't tell us about that. Throughout Luke's gospel, Jesus is a very compassionate healer. In fact, in his very first sermon, Jesus announces that he has come to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
What does that mean?
According to Luke, Jesus inaugurates a new age in the history of God's relationship with the world. In the first age, so to speak, God identified and elected Israel to be the chosen people. Through them, God would bless the world. In this second age, Jesus embodies God's love, compassion, and mercy for the world in his very person. This new age is signified by the healings and other miracles Jesus performs, and also through the declaration of God's intent to save all people. In the third age, Jesus will ascend to heaven and empower his disciples, both then and now, to carry on his work of healing and reconciliation until he comes again.
So we're living in this third age.
Right, and so we're commissioned to bear Jesus' presence in the world. That is, we're called to do the things Jesus came to do: care for the poor, release those who are captive, tend the needs of all people, and announce God's favor.
That makes what we do pretty important.
It certainly does, which is why this message of healing and reconciliation runs throughout Luke's gospel and comes up again in the Passion, particularly in this scene at the Mount of Olives, in a later scene where two political enemies, Pilate and Herod, become friends, and again at his crucifixion. So let's turn there next. As they led Jesus away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Okay, so I see what you mean about Jesus being compassionate. He forgives the people who are crucifying him and is very kind to the criminal. But the whole scene somehow seems a little different.
Say a little more.
Well, it definitely shows the horror of the cross, like Mark, but I don't know. Luke seems to do everything with a softer touch. I mean, some of the people following also seem upset. And one of the criminals is actually respectful, even comforting. So it's dark, but not quite as dark.
I think you're right. In Luke's story, people are still against him, but not everyone. As with the disciples, Luke is thinking ahead to the next part of the story when all kinds of persons, including lots of Jews, some of whom may have been present when he died, come to believe he was the Messiah.
You said earlier that while Mark only describes Jesus as crying out in despair, Luke tells us about three things Jesus says. We just heard the first two: Jesus forgiving the crowd and promising the criminal that he'll join Jesus in paradise. What's the third?
That comes right at the end. Here it is from chapter 23. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
Once again, the disciples come off a little better. I mean, they may not have stayed with him, but they don't totally desert him either, as Luke tells us that they stood at a distance watching. But what really struck me is how much Jesus trusts God right up to the end. It's clearly agonizing and all, but he doesn't seem to despair like he does in Mark. That really comes through in the last thing he says about putting his spirit in God's hands.
That's true. Jesus is, in every sense, righteous and trusting. That's probably why Luke reports the centurion declaring Jesus' innocence, to show that even Gentiles can see that he is righteous.
Why is that important?
Throughout Luke's gospel, he has stressed that Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah who has come to fulfill the promises in both the law and the prophets and save not only Israel but all the world. So Luke regularly shows how Jesus keeps the law at every step of his journey, and how even Romans, first Pilate in a scene we didn't read, and now the centurion declare his innocence and therefore his righteousness.
Does this follow through to the story of the resurrection too?
It does. In fact, Luke adds a whole new scene.
Really?
Yeah, the first scene is similar to Mark's, except that the women do come back and tell the disciples what happened. The disciples, of course, don't believe it.
What do you mean?
Well, all the Gospels report disbelief before belief. I think they want to make the point that the news of resurrection, of life actually defeating death, really is pretty amazing and quite honestly difficult to believe. But I also think they want to tell us that maybe doubt and faith are woven together a little more closely than we might have imagined.
Can you say a little more?
Sure, we tend to think that faith is the opposite of doubt. But in the Bible, faith doesn't imply that you don't have any doubt, but rather that you hang on and keep trusting God even if you do have doubts.
I think I like that. I mean, there's a whole lot I'm not sure of, and it's kind of cool to think that that's all right. But what about this new scene?
It takes place on the evening of the first Easter, the day Jesus is raised from the dead. Two disciples are walking home, totally stunned by what happened. Jesus joins them on the road, except they don't recognize him. So he starts to interpret the Bible and explain that all of this had to happen for God's mercy to be revealed to the whole world. And then when he's at supper with them, he breaks the bread, tears it apart, and gives it to them. And suddenly they recognize him just as he vanishes from their sight. In response, they immediately get up and go back to Jerusalem to tell the other disciples what they saw.
That's quite a story.
Yeah, and it again shows how Jesus fulfills the prophecy in the Jewish scriptures about being the Messiah. But it also addresses Mark's concern about how you talk about resurrection with people who have never seen Jesus in person.
I'm not sure I caught that.
That's understandable because it's pretty subtle. But think again about what happens in Jesus' encounter with these two disciples. First, he interprets the scriptures so that they can understand them. Second, he sits with them at supper, and as Luke writes, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them.
That sounds kind of familiar.
It's almost identical to the way Luke describes what Jesus does at the Last Supper, and it's the same language that we often use in church at Holy Communion.
So, first he interprets the Bible and then shares a special meal. And that's when they see him? That sounds actually a lot like church service.
Exactly. It feels like Luke is saying, if you want to see Jesus, gather with the faithful, reflect on God's word, share the meal Jesus gives us, and through all this, God will encounter you. And that's ideally what the church is supposed to be.
So, like Mark, Luke wants to say something about how later Christians can also be Jesus' disciples.
Right. And in fact, in his Acts of the Apostles, Luke goes a little further, stressing that anyone can be a disciple. Men, women, Jews, Gentiles, slaves, free, anyone. What Jesus does through his cross and resurrection dissolves all the differences between people that we usually focus on.
That's very cool. Since we're on the topic of Acts, though, can I ask another question?
Shoot.
If Luke wrote a second book, how does it end this part of the story about Jesus' cross and resurrection?
After this appearance to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, Jesus appears once more to the disciples and shows them again how his life, death, and resurrection fulfill the Jewish prophecies for a Messiah, and tells them that they, as his witnesses, need to share this message of God's love, healing, and forgiveness with all people. And then he tells them to wait for God to give them the power to do these things. And Jesus ascends to heaven.
And that's where the Acts of the Apostles picks up?
In Acts, Luke recaps the gospel for his audience and starts the story with the ascension and continues quickly to Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes upon the disciples and gives them the courage and ability to tell everyone about Jesus.
And this is the third age you were talking about, when Jesus' disciples share the good news about God's love and mercy and continue Jesus' work of healing and helping everyone.
Right. Jesus commissions his disciples, then and now, to be his witnesses and to do the things he's doing.
Is that kind of like Mark wanting us to pick up the message from the women when they couldn't pass it on because they were too afraid?
It's sort of like that, but in the book of Acts, Luke has the chance to go into a lot more detail about what being a follower of Jesus looks like.
So let me see if I have this straight. Luke's Jesus is also very human, but where Mark emphasized Jesus' suffering, Luke underscores a little more Jesus' tremendous compassion, healing, and trust in God. And this way, Luke shows that to be a disciple of Jesus, you do the things Jesus was doing: healing, helping, and witnessing to God's love and mercy.
Right. Part of what Luke is saying is that God's power becomes evident whenever and wherever people, Jews or Gentiles, treat each other with the care and compassion that Jesus shows.
Got it. Okay, then let's go on. Matthew next. I remember you said that that was the other gospel that relied on Mark.
Good memory. Yeah. We'll turn next to Matthew. And that's where we'll end for today. And we will see you next time.